Hi, my name is Steve Rahi. I am a principal customer engineer focused on management technologies. Today's discussion is a session that will discuss Microsoft Tunnel, which is part of Intune, which of course is part of Microsoft Endpoint Manager. Microsoft Tunnel is, here's our agenda that we'll be going through in this typical agenda. Microsoft Tunnel, let's just jump right in. What is Microsoft Tunnel? So Microsoft Tunnel is a recent addition, starting at the bottom, to Intune. Right now it is in public preview. I tend to try to stay away from talking about features that are in public preview, but sometimes features elevate themselves to a level where it makes sense, and this one certainly does, right? So being in public preview, that means it will have some additional development behind it. I already know of some things planned for enhancements to Microsoft Tunnel. An example right now, Microsoft Tunnel only supports iOS and Android, but there's plans to expand that going forward. So currently in public preview. So what is it? Essentially, Microsoft Tunnel is a VPN gateway. It is a VPN gateway that is Intune focused and deployable so that devices that are managed by Intune are able to have another avenue by which they can access internal network resources, right? And that's the point. So if you have a device on the internet, an iPhone, an iPad, an Android tablet or phone or whatever, and those devices need access to applications that are on your internal network, then the Microsoft Tunnel VPN gateway is one way that when those apps launch, as an example, you can have that tunnel connected. That's called per app VPN initiation. And then there's also on-demand opportunities to configure the tunnel so that if a device accesses a certain subnet or IP range, right, that you can have the tunnel automatically initiate and so on. Right? It's all about access to internal resources. So you also see a reference to App Proxy. So App Proxy is a mechanism in Azure that is a means of allowing applications to be published so that devices that are on the internet can access them even though they're on the internal network. And App Proxy is certainly an awesome solution. There are certain apps where maybe App Proxy is not the most suitable, and so that's where Microsoft Tunnel is there as an additional option, right? With Microsoft Tunnel, for example, there's no requirement to publish any of your internal apps. They just get access the way they normally do through a VPN connection. So why do we care about Microsoft Tunnel? Well, again, App Proxy is the only option we had prior to having Microsoft Tunnel, and there were certain situations where App Proxy was not the best solution. And so the ability to have something like Microsoft Tunnel is definitely an advantage. Conditional access, so ensuring your devices have the correct metrics around them or the correct controls around them when they're accessing internal network resources. That is conditional access. Microsoft Tunnel can work through conditional access. There is a little bit of extra configuration necessary for that, which I'll show you near the end of the session, but certainly can and does support conditional access. All right. So what are the requirements if we're going to implement Microsoft Tunnel? What are the requirements? Well, there's a few, and there's a few more that I'll drill into in a minute in terms of components that we need. But in terms of requirements, certainly you need Intune, right? Because this all runs through Intune. You need the Azure Public Cloud. I call that out because right now the Microsoft Tunnel capability is not supported in Azure Government Cloud, so Public Cloud is what we need. We need iOS, iPadOS, or Android Enterprise devices that we can manage here. So again, that list of devices that we can support will expand as time goes by, but that's what we need right now. We need a Linux server that is properly configured. So Microsoft Tunnel does run on a Linux server. It hosts the Microsoft Tunnel Gateway service. Now, this can be a machine that is virtual or physical. That's fine. And if it's a virtual machine, it can be either on-prem or in Azure, whichever you would like. It does need to be a 64-bit machine, and then on the screen you'll see the list of distributions that are currently supported for Microsoft Tunnel. The one thing to call out here is that the device, in order to use Microsoft Tunnel, devices must be enrolled in Intune. There are some situations where devices can be managed through things like app protection policy and so on without being directly enrolled in Intune. That is not true here. The device must be enrolled in Intune in order to make use of the Microsoft Tunnel VPN. And then in order to make use of the Microsoft Tunnel VPN, there is an app available in the iOS and Android app stores right now called Microsoft Tunnel app, and that app needs to be deployed on your devices. Okay, so in terms of scale, also wanted to throw this out there. In the demo today, that will start shortly, we're going to configure a single Linux server that will act as our Microsoft Tunnel Gateway. Actually, that's not really true. I already have everything set up, and I have a Linux server that is functioning as my Microsoft Tunnel Gateway. I'm going to go add a second one that I can show you the configuration through. I'll only take it to a certain point because unless I have a load balancer in front of things, it's not really going to be effective anyway. But I'll take you through the configuration. And that's where we get the scale. You can have multiple tunnel servers if you need them, right? Take a look at the screenshot that I've taken out of our documentation that talks about the number of devices and the number of CPUs, and then you can figure out how many your environment has, what your anticipated load is, whether you need multiple, whether you need to put a load balancer in front. Because if you are going to have multiple Linux servers functioning as Microsoft Tunnel Gateway servers, you will need a load balancer to direct the traffic between them. All right? So this is here. Okay, and now, we talked about the requirements of Tunnel Gateway. What are the components that we're going to be dealing with? Well, certainly a Linux server that will host the Tunnel Gateway service. Again, this can be a physical machine that is on-prem. It can be a virtual machine that's on-prem or in Azure, whichever makes the most sense in your environment. It does need to be a 64-bit machine, but besides that, it can run wherever you would like it to be. There are components that are precursors and requirements to even install the Microsoft Tunnel Gateway service. One of them is Docker. Needs to be version 19.03 or better. And one thing about Docker. So here's a little tangent. This is a service, Tunnel, that requires a Linux server. If you want to make me feel utterly and completely a neophyte when it comes to technology, put me in front of a Linux server, right? And so there may be others like me that are interested in Microsoft Tunnel and configuring things. So there's a couple of bits of news, kind of good news, I guess. One is that the documentation that we have, and I'll point you to some at the end of the session, is really, really, really good about how to do this with a Linux server. It gives you step by step by step by step of exactly what to do. So if you had zero knowledge of Linux, you could successfully install Tunnel without much problem, right? The other thing to know is as distributions, I showed you a list of 4 different distributions that we support with Tunnel. Every one of them have a lot of similarities, and every one of them have uniquenesses, right? So you will see me use Red Hat as my Linux distribution, and there's a certain way to install Docker on Red Hat, but installing Docker on Ubuntu is different, right? And the good news is our documentation points to the instructions for how to do it on every distribution. And then another thing that I'll call out here since I'm talking about it, Linux is a case-sensitive operating system. So if you have, for whatever reason, your caps lock key on whenever you specify a file name and save that file name and then try to reference that file name with lowercase, the file name is not going to be found. So just be aware that it is case-sensitive. Okay. All right, so you'll see me install Docker here in a bit. And there's actually one little change we're going to have to make with Docker, because when you install Docker on Red Hat, there's a tweak that has to be in place for those distributions and so on. But again, that's all documented, and you'll see me do it in a minute. You also need a TLS certificate. Now, this can be a certificate that's issued by a third-party CA, and that's really probably preferred, is easiest for sure, because if you have a certificate issued by a third-party CA, then the devices on which that certificate will operate will already be trusted, or will already trust that third-party CA, or they should. Right? Now, you can also issue the cert from your internal certificate authority, and that's what I'm going to do, and I'll show you how to do that. There is an additional requirement that the internal certificate authority that issues that certificate be fully trusted by the devices. So that's where you'll need to export your trusted root certificate authority chain and import that to your devices. I'll show you how to do that as we go on through. So another component is your network. So here in my lab, I'm simple, right? I'm going to show you a very simple setup. In a production environment, it's recommended that you use 2 NICs per Linux server, and the reason for that is to help split the traffic. So the idea might be NIC 1 would be traffic from your managed devices, and that would be traffic coming from your public network. You'll see a diagram of this, I think, on the next slide. NIC 2 would be traffic from your on-prem resources, and should be just on the internal network so that you can shift between. Again, that's a production consideration. That's not what I have at all. In my lab, I just have 1 NIC, works fine, but calling that up. And another thing, your firewall. So there's 3 ports that you likely will need, 2 that you need, 1 that's optional but you need, and that's port 443 for TCP and UDP is required inbound, and at least TCP 443 outbound, right? And then you need port 80 outbound TCP, and then finally inbound port 22. That's the optional one, and that's to enable connections through SSH and SCP that you'll see me use in a minute to access my Linux server that's running or will be running in Azure. Finally, on the network side, proxy. This is if you need it. So in my lab, I don't have a proxy. I don't need a proxy. But if you have one, if you need to use that, then you will want to make sure it's configured properly to work on the network. Now, there's a few things about this. If you're using a proxy, then you're going to need to configure that on the Linux server, and there's places you would edit this detail. So let me show you an example. Pull in a notepad doc here. So for example, if you're going to add a proxy, and I'm not going to, so I've not tested this in my environment, but on a Linux server, the directory where you would want to go edit the config files is here, and then these are the fields that you would want to add specifying your proxy, right? Now, a couple of words about proxies. Authenticated proxies aren't supported. The proxy can't perform something called break and inspect, right? And so here's where you would configure a proxy in general. Now, if you're using a proxy, you'll also need to configure that proxy for use with Docker, and that's done differently. So if I scroll down, here is where you would make the edit. This is the directory, and then you would put in these lines, right? Again, I'm not doing it, so just wanted to call that out and show you, but configure if you need to. Right? Okay, so also you will need a VPN profile that, sorry, I skipped ahead. Again, the device must be enrolled in Intune in order for it to be able to use the tunnel gateway. In order to enable the device to try to use the tunnel gateway, you'll need to configure a VPN profile and specify in that profile to use the Microsoft Tunnel as the VPN, and I'll show that to you. And then finally, for the device to establish the connection, you'll need the Microsoft Tunnel app deployed to the device, and I will show that to you as well. So here's a little bit about how this works. It's a kind of a busy diagram, very informative diagram. Let's walk through this quickly. So we're going to start by looking at the components, and then we'll look at the flow through those components whenever the tunnel is instantiated and used. So the first component is A, and that is Intune, right? The next component is B, and that's Azure AD. Component C will be your Linux server that has Docker running on it. Now again, this diagram shows one Linux server. You can have multiple for scale if you need to. And so on the Linux server, we have C1, the Microsoft Tunnel Gateway. C2 is the management agent running on the Linux server. And then C3 is the authentication plugin that is for authenticating with Azure AD and that kind of thing. Then we have D, and D is going to be your public-facing IP address or FQDN that is specified with the Microsoft Tunnel, right? Now, a couple of tangents here. In the lab, I'm just using IP. I am not using FQDN, and you'll see that in a couple of areas coming up. Another thing, in this diagram, it's assuming one Linux server, and that may be true. But there could be multiple. And again, if you are using multiple, you will need a load balancer. And so the IP address or FQDN would be that of your load balancer at that stage, and then the load balancer would hand off to the Linux servers that are behind it, right? Okay, and so E would be an MDM enrolled device or a device enrolled in Intune, in this case, iOS or Android. Then F, we have our firewall that would stand between the device and the internal network. G, we would have optionally an internal proxy server. And then H, finally, would be access to our internal corporate network. And I is the public internet. Now, let's walk through this and see the flow of events as things are configured and things start to communicate. So option 1, the Intune administrator is going to configure a section called Server Configurations and Sites. I'll tell you what that is. I'll show it to you in a minute, and it'll make more sense. But basically think of it this way. You're going to have your Linux server, and that Linux server is going to host your Microsoft Tunnel Gateway service. Well, the Microsoft Tunnel Gateway service has to be configured as to how it should operate when providing that VPN connection through it, right? So in Intune, there's a section called Server Configuration, and that server configuration will specify how the Linux server needs to be configured in order to support the tunnel gateway, right? Now, that server configuration by itself won't do anything. So you need an additional part called a site. Think of a site as a place where one or more Linux servers hosting the tunnel gateway can be placed. And what happens is you're going to take the server configuration that you build and you're going to associate it with a site. So whenever you have your Linux server join into a site, which you'll see, then it's going to automatically receive the server configuration because it is a member of the site. So any Linux server that you then join to that site will receive that configuration. Again, you'll see that in a minute. That's step 1 that happens to get this configured. Step 2, right here. So the Intune administrator will install the Microsoft Tunnel Gateway, and the authentication plugin, which is here, is installed and can now communicate with Azure to take care of authentication needs, right? step number 3 is over here. And so what happens is the management agent that's also on the Linux machine is going to communicate with the Microsoft Tunnel Gateway, is going to communicate with the server configuration and retrieve that server configuration and also send telemetry logs into Azure. Item 4, the Intune administrator ultimately creates and deploys a VPN profile that will direct devices to use the Microsoft Tunnel and the Tunnel app that's installed on the device. Step number 5, the device will authenticate with Azure AD, and if present, conditional access policies will be evaluated at that time. Step number 6A here, A and B right here, right? So if we have a split tunnel, may not, I don't in my lab, but if we have a split tunnel, then the device will evaluate which traffic goes to the public internet, which traffic goes through the VPN gateway, right? And then finally, the traffic that goes through the VPN gateway into the tunnel is going to be evaluated, ultimately sent to the internal network, maybe through a proxy, maybe not, right? So, couple of thoughts, right? So, conditional access, if we have that, which you should, it's really an awesome little piece to be able to add in to the Microsoft Tunnel Gateway. But conditional access is done in the VPN client, right? And is based on the cloud app Microsoft Tunnel Gateway. This is what I mean when I said this is not there by default. You have to add it. So I'll show you how to do that. Really easy to add that app, and very useful. But when you have that, when you have conditional access in place and operating, non-compliant devices won't receive the access token they require from Azure AD and therefore can't access the VPN server. That's how we enforce conditional access in that case, right? If the device is compliant, yeah, we get the token, everything's fine, we go on through the VPN, no problem. The management agent that again runs in the Linux server here is authorized against Azure Active Directory using a combination of Azure App ID and secret key. And then finally, the tunnel server gateway itself uses network address translation to provide addresses to VPN clients that are connecting to the corporate network. Why do I point that out? Because when we go configure our server config, that's one of the things we're going to need to do is supply the NAT addresses that are used for facilitating device connection into the tunnel. So configuring. This is basically an overview of the steps that we're going to show in detail in a minute. So basically what we're going to do to get Microsoft Tunnel configured is we're going to first identify a Linux server that will host Microsoft Tunnel. I'll show you building that from the ground up. We're going to go provision some TLS or a TLS certificate that is going to be required for Microsoft Tunnel. We're going to go prepare our Linux server to host Microsoft Tunnel. That means we're going to load some prereqs on it. We're going to install Docker. We're going to transfer the TLS certificate file we create to the Linux server. We're going to run through a readiness assessment with the readiness tool. Then we're going to go configure the Microsoft Tunnel to have the required settings that it needs in the Endpoint Manager console. Then we're going to go configure the Microsoft Tunnel service itself on the Linux server, and ultimately we're going to configure a device that will be able to leverage Microsoft Tunnel. So let's get started. So I'll just go ahead and tell you, this demo is a bit in the weeds. I'm going to show you step by step how to go about configuring Microsoft Tunnel. You're going to see all of the commands that are needed on a Linux server being done, right? So I'm doing it at this level of detail, both because I want you to see it happen here and see everything get built so you can see how long it really takes, really to set this up from ground up. Now, I've done it a few times, so I've got the experience with it, but setting it up from scratch probably a couple of hours to do it. Here, it's going to be about an hour-ish to get it done, right? The whole session here is going to be maybe an hour and a half of presentation. So it's not really that much time to get things going. So we're going to start completely from scratch. I'm going into Azure, and here is my Intune. I'm going to go to Azure first. And so I'm going to provision a Linux server. And I'm actually going to let the video run while the Linux server is provisioning to show you how fast this is when provisioning just a basic build in Azure. So I'm here, and I'm just going to, I can get to virtual machines a couple of different ways. I'm just going to start off in the marketplace because I'm going to use a Linux image that is in the marketplace to get started. So I'm going to click on marketplace. And then I'm going to search for Red Hat. Okay, and I want Red Hat at least 7.4, so I indeed have that. And I'm going to go create this here. So there's a couple of things that I need to go specify. Specifically on the Basics tab, I need to specify a resource group that's going to hold and contain my Linux virtual machine. If you're not familiar with what a resource group is, I would encourage you to go look at the documentation to fully understand it. In short, a resource group effectively is a sandbox. And in that sandbox, you can place resources that will need to be able to communicate and see each other within the sandbox. If you place the Linux server in one resource group and then place your networking assets in another resource group, that's never going to work because the networking assets need to be able to connect to the Linux server and so on, right? So that's very in short. If you aren't familiar with resource groups and some of the basic concepts of Azure, definitely encourage you to go take a look. So now I'm going to name the Linux server. So I'm going to call it mst-cc-rhel74. So that's the name of my Linux server that's out there right now. So I'm going to call this one -1. Okay. All of this detail comes pre-configured from this region and all. That's where my resource group is. So that's picked up from the resource group size. I'm just going to leave it alone. Administrator account. So when we connect to a Linux server, we're going to do it through SSH, right? And so as a convenience, I'm going to actually store off my credential information into a file. A PEM file that I can then specify when I use SSH or SCP to connect to the Linux server, and I avoid a password. It's also more secure to do it that way. Then I also need to specify a username. So I'm going to use Bill. I'll go ahead and give you a spoiler as to why. So at the end of this presentation, there's a document I'm going to show you that is a phenomenal walkthrough. Setting up exactly the way I'm going to set up Tunnel here, right? In that documentation, they use the username Bill, and their documentation is based on that. They also have the Linux server name, the same name I just used, and so I'm using it that way just to be true to the documentation they provide. Ultimately, this can be whatever account it needs to be. Then I'm going to select what ports need to be allowed. I'm going to select all 3, and then I'm going to configure disks. Now, there's really nothing I need to change here. I'm just going to take the defaults, go to networking, and there's really nothing I need to change here either. I just need to make sure that the virtual network and public IP and all of this is what I expect it to be. And then I'm just going to jump ahead to review and create. So we validated the virtual machine, and now I just need to go and say, yes, I want to go create this. So I'll get prompted to download my key pair. So I'm going to go ahead and download that. And then it's going to go to provisioning. Now, I'm not stopping this. I'm just going to let this go, right? And you're going to see the deployment in progress. It'll take a few seconds, not a tremendous amount of time, as you'll see. So provisioning the virtual machine in Azure, very, very, very quick. Now, I'm using Azure because it's convenient to use Azure. We already have the Linux distributions that I need here. You can use a physical machine, as I mentioned, it's completely up to you and your config. But Azure's really straightforward and easy to do. So we'll just give this a moment or two. Again, I'm not going to pause the video, and you'll see how quick we get provisioned. I could actually go and start into the TLS certificate stuff, but I want to stay here just enough for you to see how quickly we get provisioned. Okay, and that quick, we're done. So I failed to look at my deployment start time, but I believe that was less than a minute, and we're ready to go. So I'm going to click Go to Resource, and so we're now at that resource. We'll pause here on the Linux side. We'll come back to the Linux side in a minute. But for now, what I want to do is shift gears. And this is Windows, right? This should be familiar for those Windows administrators and those non-Linux administrators. And we're going to use my certificate authority to go create our TLS certificate. Now, the way this particular server is in a domain that isn't a domain any which way associated with my Linux server or the gateway tunnel gateway, right? I tell you that because you can produce a TLS cert from any certificate authority that you want. And then what we're going to do is export that certificate so that we can use it with Linux, right? So I'm using my certificate authority that I use for everything else just for convenience. And I already have things configured here, but let me walk you through it as if I did not. So I'm going to launch my certificate authority. So before I get into it, let me talk about the certificate just a little bit, right? So in terms of the certificate, again, it can be a third party, or it can be your local certificate authority, like what I'm going to do here. If you're going to use a third party, then you can go get your certificates for free on services like DigiCert, or there's also, I can't remember. Let's Encrypt, I think, is the site that you can go use to get a free certificate for Linux as well. So a few details about the TLS cert, right? So the TLS cert is going to be generated here, but then it's going to be copied to my Linux server because it is used to secure the tunnel gateway endpoint. Typically, whenever you create the cert, you're going to supply the IP address and the FQDN. I'm sorry. Typically, you're going to supply the FQDN of that Linux server. Now, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to only use the IP address because I didn't want to have to go to the trouble of making my servers accessible on the public internet and so on through DNS. So I'm just going to use the IP address. You can use just the IP address. That's fine. In the subject alternative name of the certificate, typically you will place both the IP address and the FQDN. I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to generate my subject alternative name with the IP address. And one point about certs. In my experience, setting up the tunnel gateway a few times, the only time I ever had issues is when I failed to build the cert correctly. So I'll show you near the end of this how you can see what's going on with the cert and do some troubleshooting if you're having some connection challenges, but I just call that out, right? A really important point, which I'll reiterate, is that the TLS cert cannot have an expiration that is longer than 2 years. We do have some limited wildcard support. So asterisk.contoso.com, for example, is supported, but CONT**.com is not. So be aware of that if you want to do wildcarding. When you install the TLS cert, know again that depending on where you generate it, the device may or may not have the full trust chain to be able to trust that cert. So in the case where I'm generating it from my internal CA, I need to make sure that the device fully trusts not only the cert here that I'm going to generate, but also has the full trust chain so that it can trust the source of the cert. You'll see me do that. Okay, so let's go about creating my TLS cert. Again, I have the TLS cert already created, but I'm going to walk through the process. So here is my certificate authority. I'm just going to expand and go down to certificate templates. I'm going to right click and select manage. And so what I need to do is go down to my web server template, and I need to duplicate that template. So a few things here. On the general tab, I'm going to give this a name. So I'm just going to leave this as default because I'm not going to actually save this. But you need a name that is informative for you. The validity period no longer than 2 years. Again, if it's longer than 2 years, the certificate will not be accepted or will cause you problems. On the subject name tab, you need supply in the request. So that is the default, but just calling out it needs to be there. On extensions, then under the application policy section, you need to make sure that your cert shows server authentication, which by default on the duplicated web server template it does. On request handling, so here you need to allow the private key of this cert to be exported. That allows us to export this and load it onto the Linux server and be good, right? On the security tab, I need to add a system. Now, I'm going to add a computer, right? So here, I'm just going to allow for computers, and I'm going to specify this computer, right? Check names, add that in, and add the enroll permission to this particular server. Now, why am I doing that? Because there will be a requirement. You have to enroll for this TLS certificate in order to obtain it. So it doesn't really matter what system enrolls the cert. It could be a server, it could be a workstation. It doesn't matter. As long as the system can enroll the cert, that's fine. Because we're then going to immediately turn around and export the cert and move it to the Linux server so that it can be done. So you see that I just created my cert. Now I said I wasn't going to do that, but I'll take it one step further. So now that I've done that, I'm good. I just need to issue that new cert. So I'm going to right click and manage. No, sorry, I lied. I'm going to right click, not manage, and new certificate template to issue. And I will see in the list copy of web server cert. That's the one that I would hit OK and be able to issue at that time. That would be my Microsoft Tunnel cert. Now I'm going to go delete this. I'm going to click manage here and go delete that because I don't need it. And I'm going to show you the Microsoft Tunnel cert that I actually have created is right here. Tunnel Gateway Cert. It's already there. It's already been flagged to be able to be issued. So I am good to go. Okay. So now I've got the certificate configured. I've got the certificate published. And now I just need to go enroll the certificate. So the way I'm going to do that, again, this is the machine that I approved to have the enroll permission for the cert. So I'm going to go to certlm.msc, and under personal certificates, I'm going to right click all tasks, request new certificate. Okay, next and next. So you see I have the Microsoft Tunnel Gateway cert here. If you don't see the Microsoft Tunnel Gateway cert here, that means you probably have a misconfiguration, or you do have a misconfiguration in the certificate template that you need to go correct. But you also see that there's a blue line here that basically says you need more detail. So I'm going to click on that line. There's two things I'm going to add. First, I'm going to add the common name. Right now, my name of my Linux server is mst-cc-ls RHEL 74-1. So that is the name of my Linux server. I also need the IP address. So I'm going to go find the IP address, which is here. That's the public IP address. I'm going to copy that to my clipboard and then go back over here and simply supply that. So I'm going to supply that. Now, in addition, I need my subject alternative name here, DNS. And typically, you would supply the FQDN portion here, plus the IP address. I'm just going to use the IP address and add that in, and I'm good. Okay? Now you see that I've supplied the required detail. So I'm going to place a check mark in here and say enroll. So I successfully enrolled. And now I have that cert. It's right here. Now I need to go export the cert because, again, the whole reason I enrolled it here is so that I can move it to the Linux server. So I'm going to right-click on this, All Tasks, and Export. Okay? A very key thing, yes, the private key needs to be exported, and that's going to change it into a PFX format, and I'm going to supply a password for this certificate. You will need to use this password when you import the certificate as part of the Tunnel Gateway config. Click Next, and just specify my my export directory, which is going to be, this is an extra one that I don't need. I'm just going to specify TLS1 and save it. So save. Yes, I'm going to make sure I don't overwrite that. Okay, so TLS1, save. Yes. Okay. Next. So that is my cert that is now exported. Okay. Now, I'm done here. I can delete this cert. In fact, I will. There's no reason to keep it around because it's not useful anywhere except for the tunnel itself. So I'm going to go ahead and close that. Another thing I need to do, since I issued the certificate from my internal certificate authority, I need to make sure my trusted root key from my certificate authority is available. To do that, I'm going to go into Properties, click View Certificate, click Details, and then Copy to File. And I'm going to walk through this wizard, and it's going to default to a CER format, which is fine. I'm going to browse for the file name, and you're going to see that I have root CER already here. So I've actually already exported this, so I'm not going to do it again, but I wanted to show you the process. So that done, I have completed the process of enrolling for and exporting my my certificates that I will need later. Okay, so I'm going to get rid of my domain controller for now. And let's go back to Azure where I have my Linux server sitting here. So one thing also that I want to do now that it's provisioned is configure my DNS name. I'm going to go click on Configure. And so this is a static assignment. If it were not a static assignment, I would want to convert it to a static assignment. Also, if I scroll down, is the option to provide the DNS name label or the FQDN, the domain portion of your FQDN. I'm not using an FQDN, and so I'm not going to specify anything here. In production, you would very likely do that, right? So I'm good to go. I am now ready to connect to this server and start to configure. Now, notice on Linux you have connect just like you do for a Windows server, but instead of going to RDP as the default, it's going to go to SSH. And then it will show me some examples of how I will go connect to the server with SSH. So I'm just going to go copy this whole line, right? And typically, or historically, not typically, I would use a tool such as PuTTY to go connect to my Linux server. I don't need to do that now because PowerShell has SSH connectivity built into it. So I'm going to go launch no, that's not what I wanted to do. I want to launch PowerShell, so let's do it this way and type it correctly and launch it here. So here's my PowerShell window. So I'm going to change my directory into downloads because that's where I have a bunch of stuff, right? There's a bunch of things that I will use. And I'm going to connect to my Linux server. So I'm just going to paste in what I copied, and I'm going to go modify this so so that I have the right thing. Right. So for my private key path, I need to specify that file that I downloaded. So the way I'm going to do that is /, and then look for the PEM. So this is the PEM file for my first Linux server. I need my second Linux server, and so that's going to be here. Yeah, that's going to be my second Linux server. And then this is my admin, my Linux admin I'm going to log in with. Here's the IP address of the Linux server. And then I need to get rid of this because it copied it twice. And I'm going to hit enter. So yes, I'm going to allow log on. And now I am logged on to my Linux server. As easy as that, right? So I'm going to go through and configure the Linux server. I'm going to do a lot of copying and pasting because that's easier than typing all of this again and again and again. I'll explain the commands as I go through them so that we can understand what we're actually configuring and what this means and so on and so forth, right? So the first part of this is that I'm going to go configure the prerequisites for my Linux server, right? The first thing I'm going to do is go install Docker. So in order to install Docker, again, this is a plain Jane Linux machine that I loaded from the marketplace. In order to install Docker, I need to go retrieve it. So I'm just going to copy in this command. So this command is going to retrieve Docker. And so a word about this command real quick. So here, sudo is, again, for the non-Linux admins out there, sudo is the equivalent of run as administrator on Windows. Or I should say run as administrator on Windows is the equivalent of sudo because sudo is first, right? Yum config manager is a Red Hat specific utility that will go out and grab content, certain repositories that you might be interested in installing. So that's what I just did. I grabbed the Docker repository from this particular host where the content will be located. Now I need to go out and grab another version, of this as well. So I'm going to do that and hit enter, and I grab that. So I've got that downloaded. Now, in order to use that content, I need to import this GPG keys for the CentOS mirror package, and I'm going to go do that here. So that's running and just worked. Okay. So I'm going to go verify that I have the GPG keys correctly. So let me make sure I do that. All right. So run that. And I should get some output here momentarily. What did I do? Oh, I need a closing quote. Sorry. All right, hang on. Let me see what I need to do on this. There it is. I see my copy and paste skills left off one character that I need. So actually, let me go. That time I got more characters than I needed. Let me go do that. And here. And so that should do it. Okay, good. So that verified that I actually have everything that I expected to have, and I just needed to quickly edit the command line to make sure I did not include extraneous character. All right, good to go. So the next thing, I'm going to go add the Docker Community Edition stable repository. So I just did that. And then now with all of those files added, it's time to go install Docker. So I'm going to go do that. Also, I'm going to do that with Yum. So here I'm going to paste that command line in. And you see up here the command line that I'm executing, install docker ce da 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 da, off we go. And as I go through and try to install it, notice failure, right? So this is what I was referencing earlier, that I need to make a tweak to one of the configuration files to correct a versioning thing, right? So I'm going to go launch my favorite text editor ever called VI that I am thoroughly confused by, and edit a file. So there, I just launched VI. Here's the config file that I'm after, and specifically, I'm needing to change an entry in the stable section to edit out this base URL. So to do that, I'm going to hit I on my keyboard, and that takes me into insert mode. Here's my cursor up at the top, so I'm just going to move the cursor down and put a pound sign in front, so that comments this out. And then I'm going to take and add another version of that line into the file. So let me copy and paste that one, hopefully. Okay, so there's the base URL I just added. So what you'll notice is this is identical, right? Except here, instead of $release server, I'm specifying 7 as the release server. And so I've finished my insert. I'm going to hit escape and then :WQ and enter. And that's going to save my entries. So with those changes saved and fingers crossed, I'm going to rerun the install for Docker and see if it works better this time. So right click, and in fact it did fix the problem, and we're starting through the install of Docker. This will take a couple of minutes. In a moment I'll be prompted to say yes to continue with the installation of Docker, and then we will be done. So let's give that a moment to process. Okay, so here's my prompt. I want to say yes to that, enter, and then we should be done fairly soon. And say yes again. And so it hangs here for a moment, but it will proceed momentarily. It's working on it. Okay, there we go. Takes a second there. When I was first working through this, I thought it was hung there, and then it suddenly moved forward, so I felt much better. All right, so once we get done, we're going to start the Docker service and then test out the Docker service to make sure that it is installed correctly and operational. Should be almost done. Okay, clean up, and so we're almost out of here. Cool. So now I've got Docker installed. I'm going to start the Docker service, which will take just a second. And then there is a way to test that the Docker service is responding using a hello world kind of command with Docker. So I'm going to run this. Should run fairly quickly. And so Docker is going to go out and say, well, it's got to go process itself. So 1 second. It's going out to retrieve it from the internet. Couldn't find it locally. And then it will run. Okay, there we go. So hello from Docker. And so we know that Docker is in fact working without a problem. So that's the first requirement, configured. Docker's here. We're ready to go. No problem. Now, the next thing we need to do is transfer our certificate that we created and exported from our Windows machine to our Linux machine. So let me go do one thing real quick. So I saved off the certificate onto a local directory on my Windows machine. I need to move that here. So let me go to my drive. Here are my tunnel certs, and here's my TLS1. So I'm going to copy that, and I'm going to place it on my workstation in the downloads folder. Go grab the downloads folder. Here's downloads. I'm just going to copy it or paste it here, so I'm good. Okay, so I'm connected to the Linux server here. I don't want to disconnect. So what I'm going to do is launch another PowerShell window, and this time I will use SCP to copy those files from my Windows machine to my Linux machine. So I'm going to connect. So SCP, I'm going to change to the downloads folder so that I have all of my content. I'm going to SCP-I, and I'm going to find my PIM file. That's it. And then I'm going to also reference my exported PFX. So here's the first Linux machine. Here's the second Linux machine. And it's going to be Bill at, and I forget my IP address, so let me go get my IP address again. Just that portion. And here, and then I also need to specify where that file is going to go. So :/home/bill. Okay, so I'm going to SCP there. It will just basically copy the file. It just copied the file. That's all I need to do right now. So I'm going to close this window, and then I'm going to go back to my main Linux session and make sure what directory I'm in. So I need to be in home and bill, okay, and I am, and so I'm going to ls-l to see a directory of the files that are there, and I have my, ls, okay, so there's my PFX file that's there that I just copied in. So this is my certificate, my TLS cert, that I needed to get in place. I'm not installing it yet, but I'm getting it in place so that I can be ready to install it. The next thing I'm going to do is run my readiness script, right? So in order to run the readiness script, I need to first get my JSON processor package installed. So like before with Docker, I'm just going to use yum to pull down the JSON package. And so here that goes, right, and so on. Then I'm going to use yum again to install it. And so that's in process. And as soon as that's done, I'm ready to pull down and run the readiness script. Taking just a moment to get this done, but we should be through with it in a bit. So we'll just let it process. Come on. Okay, so it's done. So now that I've done that, I'm ready to run the readiness script. The readiness script will test my Linux server in a couple of ways to make sure that I'm ready to go with the install of Tunnel. So I just installed the JSON processor package. That's a requirement to be able to run the readiness script. So now I need to go get the readiness script. So I'm going to use a neat little utility called wget to go out and find that information, right? So I went ahead and executed wget and connected to go ahead and get the download done. Where the heck is my command line? I've probably lost it up here a little bit. Anyway, so let's see if I can find it. Complete. Yeah, here's wget that I use to pull down my readiness script. Here's the detail for it. So it is now in place. So now I'm ready to run the script. Let's just show that it's downloaded. So now I have my PFX in my directory and then my readiness script. So before I can run a script, I have to change that script into an executable format. So I'm going to do sudo, and then I'm going to copy in the command to do that. That will change that script to where it can be executed, the change mod. And then now I'm ready to run it, right? So the first way I'm going to run this is by testing the network. So again, with sudo, I can run the script and right-click and paste. And so let me just show you from the beginning if I can fight my way up. Well, all right, fine. I'll just let it run, and then I will go scroll up. Okay, so I ran that, and scrolling up just to show you, here's me running, because it runs pretty quick. Here's me launching sudo with the network option. So here's my readiness script with the network option. So I scroll through, you see some successes. You'll also see a failure here with like a 401, bad request, 400, whatever. Those are expected right now, and so this is not a problem. You'll even see system expected error, right? Whatever, it's green, no issue. So I'm good. Now, the next thing that I want to do is test this with the account option. So I'm going to use account, and it's going to go through and tell me, okay, great. So you need to go sign in to this particular site. So I'm going to go sign in with my browser, and I'm going to pull this over a little bit. Well, let's just get the site first. Okay, so I'm going to go to the device login site, and then it's going to ask me for this code. So I'm going to put in the code, ATQ569ZD4. And then I'm going to supply, oops, okay, what did I do wrong? ATQ5, G9, 5G9. Let's try that. And I'm going to be asked to supply a username and a password. And then hopefully it will just say, okay, great, you're authenticated. And it did, right? So I've signed in successfully. And so that tells me, okay, great. Hey, I'm good to go, success. So on the account side, I've got the account that I need, no problem. I signed in successfully. And the validation here is because the account you need to use has to have certain credentials. So global admin, for example, or Intune admin, right? So we are good with that. So the Linux server is at this stage ready to accept the install of Microsoft Tunnel. The thing that we need to do now is go into the Endpoint Manager console and configure the settings required for the Microsoft Tunnel server before we proceed to install Microsoft Tunnel. So to do that, I'm going to pull back in the web browser with, and this time I'm going to shift over to Intune, right? So I'm going to go and navigate to tenant administration, and then I'm going to navigate to Microsoft Tunnel Gateway, right? And then you'll see across the top server configurations. So I already have a server configuration that I've already built for my existing gateway server. So typically what you would do is create new and then fill in the detail of the settings that you want. But I've already got it, so I'll just show you what I've already created and click on it. So I'm going to edit. So here's the name, Demo Server Config. I'm going to click on Edit for Settings, and let's just talk through it. So IP address range. I mentioned that there will be an IP range that the Tunnel Gateway server will use and use through network address translation to allow the devices to communicate. That's what this is. So this particular IP range is one that is not in use anywhere else in my lab, and frankly, it can be whatever you want it to be. Even the default probably will be fine of 169. whatever. But this is what I'm using, and these will be the IP addresses handed out to devices as they communicate. Here's the IP address of, or here's the detail of my DNS server. You can have one or more. And so this DNS server is the one that will be responsible for resolving internal FQDN. So as devices make requests for internal resources, this DNS server needs to translate those to the correct IP address and hand them back. You can also supply a DNS suffix search. I just put in fabricam.com. This is optional. You don't have to do it. Split tunneling is optional as well. I went ahead and put in a particular IP address range here. Basically, this is the IP address range of my entire, quote, internal lab, right? So my DNS server, or sorry, my domain controller, which is also going to be hosting my web server that I'm going to use in the demo, is IP 10.0.0.7. So it's definitely part of this range, and that's going to be the IP address I put in the demo in a little bit. So it's there. And then you need to specify the server port. Typically, that's going to be port 443. And that's all I do here. So I have all of that configured, no problem. So I'm going to cancel that and then go back to tenant admin. So now that I have the server information configured, now I need to go to sites. So again, I have a site already configured. So I'll just walk you through what I have here. I'm going to go edit my properties. And so there's the name of the site. And then basically the IP address that will be the IP address the site will connect to. So this again is where I mentioned, I currently have one Linux server. I'm building another, and I'll take it through most of the config. But in my demo, I'm just going to have one Linux server, one site, and that's it. If I have more than one Linux server, the IP address that I would specify, or FQDN here, would be that of my load balancer. So just bear that in mind. And then what the server config is that is associated with the site. So as servers join this site, what configuration should be implemented onto those servers, Tunnel Gateway service, right? So that's all I have, and we should be good to go. Now, if I select servers, you're going to see one because I already have one installed. No problem, right? In fact, the health status will show you that the servers that you have installed are connected and what time they last checked in, so that you know that they are or are not healthy, right? So that config is in place. That config is required. So now that we've done that config, we are ready to proceed with the install of Microsoft Tunnel. So we have a couple of options. Let me go back to the console for just a minute. Under servers, we have the option to create, and here's a download location for the readiness tool. Here's also a download location for the installation script. Well, if I did that, it'd be fine, I would just download the installation script. I would then need to copy it from my Windows machine over to my Linux machine and install from there. That's not hard to do, but it's just a couple of extra steps that I really don't need to do because I have this really cool utility called wget, right? So I'm going to use that utility, and again, I'm going to make sure, which I know I am, and I'm going to make sure that I'm in Bill's home directory, and then I'm going to go get the readiness, I'm sorry, not the readiness, the actual tunnel install script just online using wget. So here that goes, wget, and it's the tunnel install script. So now if I ls, ls-l, I have the tunnel setup script as well. So I need to run the changed command to make that executable. So sudo, and then I'm going to copy in the changed command to make that executable. It is, and so now I'm just going to go run it. So I'm going to run sudo and the install. Well, I'm going to actually type it so you can see me type it, and then it'll just take off very quickly. MS tunnel and autocomplete, and then off we go. So it's starting, and in a moment, we're going to be required to accept or review and accept the license agreement, and then we're going to be stopped again and be asked to supply the certificate. Okay, so I'm just going to spacebar through this until we get to the end, and then Q to exit, and then off we go, and I'm going to say yes to accept it. And then we're going to process a bit more and get to another place where we now need the cert, right? So I have a couple of options here. I have already copied the cert onto the Linux server. So I could stop here and then copy the cert where it needs to be on the Linux server and then rerun the installation script, but I don't want to do that. So what I'm going to do instead is launch another instance of PowerShell, and then use another SSH connection, SSH-I period here. I always forget to go to the download folder where my PIM is located. Okay, SSH-I. By the way, the -I is very important. If you don't have it, it's not going to work. Be aware of that for you non-Linux administrators. So here's the PIM file, and then bill at, and I forget the IP address of my server, so let's go get that again. Copy. Come on, mouse. All right. So I'm connecting. So I'm now connected. So I'm going to just simply copy that cert file. So there's the PFX I need to copy. I'm going to go copy the cert file with the CP command. And actually, I'm going to type this one out too because I want you to see the command line. It's important. So sudo cp cc-mst, and let's make sure, okay, we have the PFX. And then I'm going to copy it to etc mstunnel and then private, and then specifically I'm going to name it site.pfx. So the original file name is here. It must be called site.pfx whenever we do the install. So I just copied that over. That's all I needed the second Linux window for. So I'm going to say yes here. And if the cert is found, it's going to ask me for a password. So it did find it, asked me for the password, and continue to install the tunnel gateway service. And so this install will complete in a minute. But before it completes, look what I'm having to do again. I'm having to go to this device login page. That's what I tested for with the readiness script. So I'm going to go launch a browser again and go to, well, let's just go to the device, Microsoft.com device login. There. And I'm going to specify the code again. So E5 LZ 7 alpha N6 tango. All right, I'm going to specify my account and my password, and now since the readiness tool told me I was good, this should work just fine. And so the install will finish up here in just a sec because I have authenticated. All right, good. So now it's continuing, and once this finishes, will be complete with the install of the tunnel gateway. So at this stage, this Linux server is completely good to go. In this case, I don't really care because I don't have a load balancer. I don't have a need for this second Linux server, but it is ready to go and it is here. So now that the tunnel is up and running, and I'm just curious what it did in the portal, if anything, under servers. Let's refresh that. So now I do have my second server. Here it is. No problem. If I look at health status, I show that both servers are online. No issue. Doesn't matter. I'm just going to use the one here for my demo because I don't have a load balancer, but we do show that that config was successful without a problem. Okay? So I'm done with the tunnel gateway. I am not done with configuring the requirements for the device. So let's go back into my Endpoint Manager console. So because the certificate that I generated was done by an internal certificate authority, I need to make sure that my trusted root certificate is deployed to my devices. So I've done that. Let me go to Home and go to Devices, and then go to Configuration Profiles. And you will see that I have two configuration profiles. The first, or the last, but in this case the first, is for my trusted root cert. So I'm going to click on that, and I'm going to go to Properties and show you that it is, in fact, configured. Here's the detail, here's the settings, and the file, very easy on the settings side, is root.cer. So that is my trusted root certificate file I showed you about exporting earlier. It is assigned to all devices. So this has been received by my iPad. As you can see here, my test iPad. It shows succeeded. So my test iPad now has the trusted root cert chain on it, so the TLS cert is no problem. It will accept it, trust it perfectly. The next thing I need to do is create a VPN profile that will be used to cause or to define the tunnel VPN. So by creating the VPN profile, I'm just making the VPN available on the device, but until something causes the VPN to trigger and enable, it's not going to do anything, but at least it's going to be configured there. So let's go into the VPN demo and look at the properties of it. Okay, so I have the name and such. If I click on Edit for Configure Settings, so my connection type, Microsoft Tunnel, is one of the options under here. So I choose Microsoft Tunnel, and then there's these configuration options. So for the base VPN, what name do I want to give it? And then also, I need to tell the VPN configuration what site it should be working against. In other words, when we establish the VPN connection, which Linux servers should it be operating against and trying to connect to? That is defined by the IP address that's in the site config that I showed you earlier, right? And then optionally, we have per app VPN. I have enabled this, and what that means is that when you enable per app VPN, there is the ability on applications, as you'll see in a minute, to define that when that application launches, it should initiate a VPN connection to continue through the process and use while it's running. So that's enabled. Optionally, also, you have on demand. I have not enabled anything here, but this would be, based on the IP address and so on that's being accessed, whatever rules that would apply. So I could go add, for example, and say, hey, I want to establish a VPN, and here's the restrictions and so on that I want, and on we go, right? So I'm not going to do this, but it's here. And then if you have any proxy information, that's here, right? So I've got that configured. I have deployed that already. Let me actually cancel that because I don't want to save anything new. But I have deployed this and assigned it already. Through my device status, my device has received that VPN config. No problem, right? So that's there. Now, another thing that I need to do is deploy the Microsoft Tunnel app out of either the Apple or the Google stores. So I've actually set it up to deploy. I did not deploy it this way through Intune. I just went directly to the store and pulled down the app, which is fine as long as the app is there. But under apps and under specifically iOS apps here, right? So you see that I have the Microsoft Tunnel app. I did deploy it, but it did not show up. Not sure exactly why. It is not, there's no information here, so it never actually made it to the device, but it is deployed. Now, one thing about it, when you go, let me show you, when you go to the assignments for this, so we go to properties. When you go to the assignments for this, there is the ability to specify a VPN, right? Let me edit this. When you deploy the Microsoft Tunnel app, you do not want to specify VPN. It should be none, right? Because the Tunnel app itself is going to be used to initiate the VPN. So you don't want to tell the Tunnel app to use a VPN that hasn't been initiated yet, right? So that's there. So the Tunnel app is deployed. You'll see it on the device in a minute. And then there is one other app that I have created, and that is this Edge web browser. So in this case, I want, whenever the user opens up Edge, to, at that point, initiate the VPN connection. So the way I've done that is I've just deployed this through the store, but then whenever I set the assignment here, and edit that, right, I do now specify that when this app launches, the VPN it should use is this Microsoft Tunnel. So all of that is deployed. This has been deployed successfully, as you'll see here. Let's go back to that, look at install status. So this has successfully installed. So the only one, oddly, that didn't actually deploy was Tunnel. Don't know why. Doesn't matter. I put it on the device manually. So we are good to go, right? Okay. So now that we've done that, let's actually go look at a device. So I'm going to pause just a second and load up Reflector and get my iPad screen shared, and I will be right back. Okay, so I have my iPad mirrored out here. So let's just walk through a couple of things, right? So first, I want to show you that the VPN profile is actually here. So if I tap on Settings and go under VPN, first you see it's not connected, but you do in fact see that the Tunnel VPN is present. So that means it got deployed to this device, no issue, right? And then also, just to show, the Tunnel app is deployed. So this is the Tunnel app right here, and it is deployed. So I'm going to tap on the Tunnel app just to show you that it's here. The VPN connection is not currently established, as you'll see. It says not connected, right? And then we have Edge. So when I hit Edge, because I've tested this before, it's going to go immediately to 10.0.0.7. That is the IP address of my, quote, internal web server. Happens to also be the certificate, the domain controller for Fabricam, doesn't matter, and it's going to access the default web page. If the VPN tunnel is not connected, there's no way that can happen. But as soon as I launch Edge and you see the default page come up, we're going to come back and you're going to see the VPN tunnel is established. So I'm going to tap on Edge, and you'll see it's going to go to 10.0.0.7, or it should. And it did. And so here's our default web page. So if I then go back to my tunnel app, now you're going to see that, in fact, it is connected. All right? It is connected, no problem. So very, very simple in-action demo to show you that this works without issue, right? Now, let me just move this ahead for a second. So so really that's it. That's the demo. So starting to wrap up, though, I want to talk to you about a couple of very interesting things that you can do to help in case things go wrong. So like for me, whenever I first set this up, the connection would not establish. It would just say connecting, 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 and would fail. So what options do you have? Well, if you go onto the help button, then you see that you can send logs. And that's great, right? You can click on send logs. It's going to go collect the logs and send them to Microsoft support. It's going to give you an incident ID reference number that you can then supply to support so that they can pull your logs. But if you're like me, or if you're supporting your own users, right, you want to see yourself what's going on. You may not want to log a call to Microsoft support, whatever. So you can just email IT support or have your users email IT support. And then what's going to happen is the logs that are relevant are going to be attached to the email, to an email, and I can just send them to myself. And I will. And send, right? Yep, go ahead and send. So easy as that, the logs are on their way to me. So that's really all I want to show you on the iPad, but I do want to show you in the logs real quick. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of the iPad. There we go. All right, so I've got the email on its way, but I do have the logs saved off from a previous email I sent in. So here are the logs, here and here, right? So the first log that we have is the CCM Microsoft Tunnel log. This one is going to show you connection config information and the type of connection you're dealing with. It's the smaller of the two logs. The CCM Microsoft Tunnel packet log is here. It's going to show you the most. And so let's open this up. Right, my favorite log viewer, Notepad. And so I'm going to just, to demo, I'm just going to go find. And I want to go find attempting to connect. So first, I'm going to search down. Okay? So I've got my first instance of attempting to connect. So you see, hey, I'm trying to do a mobile access VPN, attempting to connect, establishing TLS connection. Oh, no, I can't. Host name mismatch for Certs. And it tells me that, the IP address, the common name, and so on, that's configured in the cert. This is what happened to me when I first configured it. I mentioned that I did not add the FQDN, or at least that in the working version, I'm not adding the FQDN because I'm not publishing the FQDN. Instead, I'm adding the IP address. Well, here, I configured it just the way the docs talked about it with the FQDN, and then it failed because there is no FQDN published with my connections in some other places that I did it just by IP address. So there was a mismatch that I had to resolve. So I went back and recreated the cert with just the IP address. And so now if I go to the bottom of this log and search up, then I will see another attempting to connect. And this time, the TLS connection, here's the certs, using here authentication succeeded, and now we are connected, no problem. So that's a simple example for sure. but a very useful example of how you can use these logs yourself without any problem at all. Now, another thing I want to show you is this step. So I mentioned at the beginning of the session that I used a step-by-step guide for configuring this, and I did. And it's a very, very good guide called MST Deployment Guide. And so I'll just launch that. It's a PDF. It's step-by-step. Will show you exactly all the way through how to configure everything with screenshots and so on, right? That guide is available for download at the URL listed here, okay? All right. Just a couple of things. So NTLM Kerberos. So seen questions about, hey, does NTLM Kerberos work through the tunnel? And the answer is yes, right? If there's an app that requires NTLM Kerberos, it's going to work through the tunnel just the same way as it would elsewhere, because at the end of the day, it's a VPN connection. That's all it is. So no problem there at all. I mentioned conditional access. So I mentioned conditional access is not installed by default, but that it's really, really easy to install, and it is. So let me show you. So if I go to a web browser, mine's already installed, so no big deal. But if I go to a web browser and go to aka.ms / what is the link? I have it documented here. Where is it? Oh, there it is. Okay, sorry, I was looking right past it. MST-CA-provisioning. Right, that's going to download a PowerShell script right there, right? So I've already got the PowerShell. All you have to do is run it and sign into your tenant, and it will go ahead and provision it for you. I've already run this. So let me show you how this manifests, right? So if I go to Endpoint Security and then go down to Conditional Access, and I'm just going to quickly show you where this is visible. I'm going to create a new policy, give it a name. I'm not saving anything, and go to Cloud Apps, select Apps, and then if I scroll down, you'll see Microsoft Tunnel Gateway. This was not here before I ran the script, but since it is here, you can use it really easily to create your gateway. No problem, right? And then last thing, I've already shown it to you, but just to call your attention back, if you want to see how your gateway servers are doing in the console, then you can go to the Microsoft Tunnel servers or Tunnel Gateway and look under Health, and you can see the status of your gateway servers, whether they're good or not, last time they connected, whatever, right? And folks, that's it in terms of the Microsoft Tunnel Gateway. It is a very powerful component that offers some really good additional options beyond what you might just have with app proxy. So thanks for hanging out. Take a look at it, and happy VPN Microsoft Tunnel Gateway configuration. Talk to you later.